My family kicked me out in the middle of Christmas dinner. No warning, no argument. Just my sister looking me dead in the eye and saying, "We've all decided you should leave and never come back." For a second, everything around me froze: the lights, the laughter, the smell of roasted turkey. And then I smiled. I pulled an envelope from my pocket, held it up for all of them to see, and said, "Okay then. I guess you won't be needing this." I tore it clean in half. Their faces collapsed before the paper even hit the table, and when they realized what I had destroyed, they started screaming like I had set the house on fire. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say, "Listening" in the comments, or tell me where you are watching from. I love knowing how far my story reaches. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if my story touches something in you, even just a little, please consider subscribing. It means more than you know to someone who spent years feeling unheard. My name is Arden Vale, and this is how the people who raised me decided I was disposable, until the moment they realized what they had truly lost. I was 30 years old, a freelance sound engineer who'd spent most of my adult life drifting between gigs and tiny apartments, and somehow I still found myself back at my parents' house in Magnolia after Maren Holloway passed away. The place hadn't changed. It still looked like a luxury showroom: warm yellow lights, polished surfaces, everything arranged perfectly, but it never felt like anyone actually lived there. Walking into it always felt like stepping into a museum dedicated to a family I didn't quite belong to. The dining room was already set when I came down: the good china, the carving knives my dad only used once a year, and a centerpiece my mom insisted added character. I took my usual seat at the end near the kitchen, the one closest to where the dishes would stack. Habit, I guess. Or conditioning. Sienna glanced at me the way she always did, as if evaluating how much space I was occupying. She talked over me without trying, slid remarks past me like I wasn't really in the room. Bryce Maddox, her boyfriend, who'd somehow decided this house was his too, lounged in Dad's chair like he owned the place, giving me that familiar nod people give when they can't remember your name or don't think it matters. My dad, Warren, sat in silence, cutting imaginary lines into the tablecloth with his eyes, while Mom orchestrated every detail, reminding Sienna to sit up straighter, correcting the angle of the serving spoons, offering little comparisons she thought were harmless, but always landed like needles. I could feel them watching me. Every time I stood up to grab a dish, every time I set something down, every time I sat back down. Something in the air was off, too rehearsed, too synchronized, like they were waiting for a cue in a play I hadn't been invited to rehearse for. I knew it wasn't about the food or the holiday. I knew because in the pocket of my hoodie pressed against my ribs was a thick, cream-colored envelope. I had written the letter inside it over 3 nights, convinced it might fix what had been breaking between us for years. I had planned to give it to them after dessert in a quiet moment as some kind of olive branch. But as I watched Sienna's eyes flick toward me and then toward my parents as if checking whether they were ready, I realized something else was happening. The room felt charged, expectant, like a storm about to crack open above our heads. I didn't know what they had decided, but I could feel it. It sat heavy in the space between us, in the way Mom's smile didn't reach her eyes, in the way Dad wouldn't look directly at me no matter how many times I tried to catch his gaze. When he finally did glance my way just for a second, I almost said something. But then he looked away, slow and deliberate, and I understood. He knew something was coming. He just wasn't going to stop it. I didn't know not then that in a few minutes this night would teach me a lesson it had taken me 30 years to miss. A few months earlier, I'd learned Maren was gone, not from my family, but from an email sent by her lawyer, a cold little sentence announcing the end of one of the only relationships in my life that ever felt simple. It didn't surprise me they hadn't told me. My family rarely told me anything unless it benefited them. I used to visit Maren on quiet afternoons by Lake Union, sitting in the wooden chairs on her porch while jazz crackled softly from her old speakers. She saw me in a way no one else did. She had this sharp way of speaking, direct but kind, and she always told me not to shrink myself to fit the rooms I was born into. Around her, I didn't have to explain why the house I grew up in felt colder than the Seattle rain. She understood that without asking. Whenever I visited her during holidays, Sienna acted like I was intruding on something she'd built. Mom fussed over Sienna's hair and clothes before every visit, and Dad hovered in the background, pretending not to listen as they discussed presentation. I always felt like an outsider walking into my own family's plans. The day we gathered at the lawyer's office downtown, the sky was the color of steel. Inside the room smelled like old wood and paper. Marin's lawyer cleared his throat and read the will. And then he said my name. Not as a footnote, not as a small portion. Everything the estate investments account's property was left to me. Mom didn't blink. Sienna shot to her feet, color draining from her face. Bryce made a sound halfway between a laugh and a gasp and muttered something about fairness. Dad turned toward the window like he needed air. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt stunned, unprepared. I had never wanted anything from Marin except her company. Outside the office, as we stood in a tight, angry silence, Sienna finally asked the first thing anyone said directly to me. What did you do to make her pick you? She asked it like an accusation, not a question. That's when something inside me shifted. It wasn't grief anymore. It was awareness. From that day forward, the house behaved differently. Conversation stopped when I walked into rooms. Laughter dulled. Mom and Dad whispered behind closed doors. Sienna hovered like she was waiting for me to slip, and Bryce watched me the way people watch a slot machine about to hit jackpot. Everyone acted polite, but the air was dense with unspoken expectations. I didn't know then that the inheritance wasn't the problem, it was the spark. The Vale family had been sitting around a pile of dry kindling for years. They were just waiting for someone to strike the match. And later that night, without realizing it, I would walk straight into the fire. In the weeks after the will reading, the house didn't relax the way I expected. It didn't settle into some new normal. Instead, the silence sharpened. Every conversation felt half-finished, every look measured. It was the kind of quiet that didn't soothe you, but warned you. Sienna started asking pointed questions, questions she'd never cared enough to ask before. What my account balance looked like, which financial advisor I planned on hiring, whether I understood how investment portfolios worked. She spoke like she was concerned, but the timing gave her away. Mom followed with her own version of pressure. She began signing up for spa subscriptions, holiday catering packages, and home organization services, leaving the invoices neatly folded on the kitchen counter. Each time she'd tap the paper and say something soft like, "Family doesn't need to divide things so strictly, Arden." Dad wasn't as direct, but his way was somehow heavier. He'd corner me in the hallway and say things like, "Your mother has been stressed. You don't want to make her worry more, do you?" The guilt in his tone didn't feel like concern. It felt like manipulation dressed up as care. Then there was Bryce, who approached me confidently one afternoon, as if he'd practiced the speech in a mirror. He told me the basement would make the perfect home gym and said it so casually it took me a moment to realize he meant using my inheritance to rebuild it. He even had a mock-up on his phone of how he envisioned the space. I didn't say yes or no, I just nodded and walked away, but even that felt like giving him too much. One evening I left my laptop open for a moment while I went to grab something from the laundry room. When I came back, the screen was tilted slightly differently. There were smudges on the trackpad that weren't mine. My email tab was open along with a banking notification I hadn't clicked. It wasn't hard to understand what had happened. Someone, maybe more than one person, had been checking my messages, my statements, my private conversations. My life no longer felt like my own. In that moment, I stopped feeling like part of a family. I felt like a resource everyone was circling around, a well they intended to drain. I didn't know what to do with that realization. I didn't know how to confront them without tearing everything apart. So instead, I tried to hold on to whatever hope I had left. I sat down in the small room at the end of the hall, the one with a narrow window facing the dark trees behind our house, and I began to write. The letter wasn't easy. I rewrote sentences over and over, trying to strike the right balance between honesty and generosity. I didn't want them to think I was trying to buy affection, but I also didn't want things to fall apart completely. For 3 nights I wrote, stopping only when my eyes burned or my hands cramped. In the end, I divided most of the inheritance between them. I left myself enough to stand on my own, but not enough to make anyone feel threatened. It was a compromise, a peace offering a way to prove I wasn't the enemy they'd convinced themselves I was. When I finally signed my name at the bottom, there was a soft burst of quiet pride inside me. I had done something good, something that might save whatever version of family we had left. But just as I placed the pen down, I heard voices outside my room, light laughter, then Sienna's voice saying she didn't think they'd need me around much longer once everything was settled. Bryce agreed, adding something about how things would finally be balanced. I froze. The words weren't loud, but they were clear. My attempt at peace was being mistaken for surrender. I slipped the letter into a cream-colored envelope, sealed it carefully, and tucked it into my hoodie pocket as if protecting the last small piece of myself. I still wanted to believe the gesture could change things. I still wanted to believe they cared enough to meet me halfway. I didn't know then that this letter, this thing I poured myself into, would be the first thing I destroyed when I finally understood the truth. When I walked downstairs on Christmas night, something in the air felt wrong. The house was too quiet, too still, like someone had pressed pause on everything except the tension. The table was full: roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, but the sight of it felt hollow. Everyone sat a little straighter, a little stiffer, their eyes flicking between each other as if waiting for someone to speak first. Sienna was the one who broke the silence. She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked about the inheritance as if we were discussing weather or traffic. I kept my answers short. I didn't want to fight, not tonight. But the questions kept coming, each one sharper than the last. Mom jumped in next, talking about responsibility and loyalty, using a tone so formal it felt rehearsed. The way she spoke, slow, deliberate, made my stomach twist. That was when I noticed Bryce lowered his hand under the table, angling his phone carefully. A tiny red light reflected off the silverware. He was recording. I didn't know why, but it made everything feel staged, like I was the only one who didn't know my lines. Sienna sighed dramatically, saying she didn't even understand how Maren could choose me when I had never been close to her. She said it with pity, as if I needed her to explain my own relationship. Before I could respond, Dad finally spoke for the first time all evening. He didn't defend me. He didn't say anything supportive. Instead, he said, "We've talked about this already." That sentence landed like a blow. They had discussed something, planned something, without me. And whatever it was, they were all in agreement. Suddenly, the table didn't feel like a dinner gathering. It felt like a tribunal, a verdict waiting to be delivered. Sienna set her wine glass down with a soft, determined clink. Then she looked right at me and said, "We've all decided. You should leave the house, and you're not coming back." The room stayed silent. No one spoke up. No one objected, not even Dad. They stared at me the way people look at a problem they finally solved. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then my hand went to my pocket, brushing the envelope I had kept close for 3 nights. The letter that was supposed to fix everything. Even then, even after all of it, a part of me wanted to believe this was just a terrible misunderstanding. That if I showed them what I had written, they would see me differently. I stood up slowly, feeling all their eyes lock onto me with anticipation. I reached into my hoodie, pulled out the envelope, and held it up. Their faces softened. Hope flickered in their eyes. They leaned in. They thought I was about to give them exactly what they wanted. I looked at them, my family, and lifted the envelope higher. "If that's the case," I said quietly, "I guess none of you need this." I didn't open it. I didn't explain. I simply held it steady and let the weight of the moment settle into the room. The room they had chosen to push me out of. The room where everything in my life was about to break open. For a moment, the room hung in an eerie stillness as I held the envelope up. Every face around the table leaned toward me, as if the future they believed belonged to them was sealed inside that folded cream paper. Their eyes tracked every small movement of my hand. Hope, greed, anticipation, entitlement, all of it flickered through their expressions like someone flipping through channels too fast. And I could see it clearly. They weren't looking at their son or their brother or even a human being. They were looking at a prize they had already claimed. I smiled because something inside me finally snapped into place. I lowered my gaze, dipped my head slightly, and then tore the envelope cleanly in half. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but the effect was immediate. Sienna shot out of her seat with a scream that didn't sound human. Her hands trembled, her face twisted as if I had taken something she had already been holding. Bryce lunged forward, grabbing at the pieces as they fluttered onto the table. He tried to straighten them out to read words that no longer mattered. His panic made everything painfully clear. Mom whispered, "What did you just do?" Her voice crackled with shock, but not the right kind. She wasn't hurt by the idea of losing me. She was hurt by the idea of losing access. Dad rose from his chair for the first time all evening, and for a split second I thought he might intervene. Instead, he walked to the kitchen doorway and shut the door quietly, like he didn't want the neighbors to hear the family's reaction unravel. Their voices erupted behind me as I turned and walked toward the stairs. Arguments overlapped, fingers were pointed, chairs scraped against the floor. I heard them asking each other what had been written in the letter, not once asking why I had written it in the first place, or what had pushed me to tear it. In my room, I didn't pack neatly. I shoved clothes into my backpack without caring what went where. Something inside me had shifted, and for the first time in my life I knew I could leave this house without waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed to. As I zipped my bag, I heard my mom's voice downstairs, low and urgent on the phone, saying the plan fell apart. I froze and listened. Paper rustled. Someone was pacing. Someone else cursed under their breath. When I stepped back into the hallway, I caught sight of Sienna in the reflection of the dark window, her shoulders shaking as she cried. But the words that slipped from her mouth weren't about losing me. She cried about what she thought she deserved, what she believed had been stolen from her. Nothing about me. I slung the backpack over my shoulder and walked down the stairs as the argument grew more frantic. None of them looked at me as a person leaving home. They looked at me as a malfunctioning asset slipping away. When I reached the front door and pulled it open, the cold air rushed in like a lifeline. That was when my mom called after me, her voice cracking. "Arden." It was just a moment of anger. "We can talk about this." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me with an ease I never knew I had. I didn't look back. I just walked into the dark winter street, breathing in air that didn't belong to them. I didn't know what waited for me beyond that porch, but I knew with certainty that whatever it was, it had to be better than the place I had just left. Behind me wasn't home anymore, just walls and furniture filled with people who had already voted me out of their lives long before they ever said it out loud. The air outside was brutally cold, the kind that bit at your lungs and left your breath hanging white in front of you. But for the first time that night, the cold felt clean. Sharp. Honest. I made it halfway down the walkway before the front door swung open again so hard it hit the wall. Footsteps slapped against the concrete, fast and uneven. Sienna ran toward me, barefoot, arms wrapped around herself as the cold cut through her thin outfit. She grabbed my wrist, her voice shaking as she said, "You misunderstood. You don't have to go like this." Her tone was small, careful, almost pleading. But beneath it I heard something else. Fear. Not of losing me. Of losing what she thought I owed her. I pulled my hand out of her grip and told her the truth. I wasn't leaving because I wanted to punish them. I was leaving because they told me to go. She went silent for a moment, then broke down with sudden frustrated sobs. "You can't just walk away with everything. You can't take the future of this family with you." Before I could respond, Bryce appeared at the doorway, shouting into the night, "You don't get to keep it all. You don't get to decide without us." His voice cracked in that way people sound when they're not fighting for principle but for personal gain. I turned back to face them, all of them clustered at the entrance, now Mom stepping outside in her slippers, Dad hovering behind her, tense and unmoving. I told them plainly that they were the ones who had told me to get out, that I was finally doing what they wanted. Mom tried to smooth it over, claiming it was anger, stress, the moment getting away from them. She said we could discuss things rationally. Dad stepped out then, not toward me, but toward them, standing just slightly behind Mom, close enough to show where he stood. His posture said more than his words ever had. When he finally spoke, it was only to say we all agreed. It needed to be said. I asked them one simple question. If I hadn't torn that envelope, would you have still told me to leave? Silence. Cold, heavy silence. That was the answer. Bryce came down the steps, closing the distance between us, and lowered his voice like he was issuing a threat disguised as advice. He told me the entire extended family would come after me if I didn't do the right thing. He said they wouldn't tolerate disrespect. That was when everything inside me clicked into perfect clarity. They didn't want me back. They wanted what I had tried to give them in that letter. They wanted the portions I had written out in my own handwriting. They wanted the access, not the relationship. I turned away from them and kept walking. They called after me, voices, overlapping accusations, pleas, guilt-laced reminders of family obligations. I didn't slow down. Not once. At the end of the street, my phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications. Text after text popped up from cousins, uncles, people who hadn't spoken to me in years, but now felt entitled to tell me what kind of person I was. Then came a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. One I read twice because it shifted something deep inside me. They planned this long before the will was read. Be careful who you trust. I stared at the words, the cold stinging my face, wondering who knew enough to warn me but not enough to sign their name. I didn't know if the message was a threat or a lifeline. That night I walked to Aiden's place, the one person I knew wouldn't demand explanations or favors. He opened the door without asking questions, took one look at my face, and told me the couch was mine. As I lay there trying to fall asleep, surrounded by the quiet of a home that didn't judge me, I realized how far from over everything still was. The real confrontation hadn't even begun yet. What happened at Christmas dinner was just the spark. The fire was still coming. 3 days after Christmas, the messages still hadn't stopped. Missed calls, long paragraphs from relatives I barely spoke to, guilt-soaked reminders about family duty, accusations that I had broken the unity of the Vale name. They all said the same thing in different fonts: fix it. Fix what they believed I had ruined. I stayed at Aiden's place, and though his apartment was quiet and warm, my mind felt numb. I wasn't angry anymore, just exhausted in a way that sat heavy in my bones. Outside, Seattle kept raining hard and steady, the kind of rain that blurred streetlights and washed the world into smeared colors. It felt like the whole city was holding its breath. One night, Aiden went out to pick up groceries, leaving me alone. I was cleaning up the living room when I heard a soft knock at the door, too soft for a stranger, too hesitant for a neighbor. When I opened it, my mother was standing there in the rain, no umbrella, hair-soaked eyes, sharp and desperate at once. She didn't even ask to come in. She just looked at me and said, "You can't turn this into something permanent. You can't make a mistake you can't undo." There was no apology in her voice, no acknowledgement of what they'd done. I kept my distance, leaning on the doorframe, and asked why she was here. She said the family had misunderstood, that Sienna let her temper get ahead of her, that Bryce pushed things too far. Convenient excuses. When I reminded her that she had agreed without hesitation that I should leave, she didn't respond. She shifted topics instead, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Tell me what was in that envelope," she said. It was suddenly so clear. She wasn't here to reconcile. She was here to regain control. She went on about the relatives, calling nonstop about the whispers spreading about how the Vale reputation was fragile and how I needed to help them salvage it. They wanted a picture, a statement, a performance that said we were still a united family. I stepped out onto the small porch, rain misting my face, and she followed. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out something I hadn't shown anyone, the real letter Maren had written to me before she died. I didn't hand it to my mother. I unfolded it slowly, let the paper breathe in the cold air, and began to read it aloud. Maren's handwriting was elegant, steady, and each word struck harder than the one before. She wrote that she chose me because I never pretended with her, because I didn't hover around her like she was a vault waiting to be cracked open. She wrote about the afternoons we spent sitting quietly by Lake Union, how she admired the way I listened, not to gain anything but to understand. She wrote that the inheritance wasn't a burden, I didn't owe anyone a piece of it, didn't need to justify. It didn't need to shrink myself to make anyone more comfortable. She told me to build a life that was entirely mine. When I reached the last line, I looked up. My mother's expression had shifted, not anger, something colder, fear. Because she understood exactly what that letter meant. It destroyed the narrative she'd already shared with relatives, this idea that I'd manipulated, tricked, or misled Maren. It exposed the truth she didn't want anyone to see. I told her plainly that they never cared about me, only about what they thought they deserved. She tried to say she loved me once, that she had always loved me, but then her voice faltered and she admitted the things she'd never said aloud. I couldn't stand the idea of Sienna having less. The rain kept falling, but everything inside me went silent. I told her I had heard the conversations outside my room the night I wrote the letter, the way they planned to manage me once the money settled. Her mouth tightened. She had no defense left. I folded Marin's letter carefully, tucked it back into my jacket, and told her calmly that I was never going back to that house. She called after me, voice shaking, saying Sienna was falling apart, and I couldn't let the family break like this. I turned and told her the truth. The family broke a long time ago. I'm just the last one who noticed. And even though every truth was finally out in the open, I didn't feel lighter. I just felt done. The next morning, Seattle was wrapped in fog so thick the skyline nearly vanished. I woke on Aiden's couch with the strange sensation that I had walked through something irreversible. Not victory, not relief. Just a doorway closing behind me, one I couldn't return through even if I wanted to. I sat there for a long minute listening to the distant hum of traffic, thinking about Marin's letter. The true inheritance wasn't the money, it was the fact that she had seen me clearly when no one else ever bothered to. Around noon, I checked my phone. More messages from relatives, but the tone had changed. Word had spread. Sienna had told her own version of the story, painting me as the one who cut ties out of greed. I didn't respond, and my silence frustrated them more than any explanation would have. After years of being expected to justify myself, it felt strange, freeing to simply not engage. Later that week, I toured a small apartment near Puget Sound. It wasn't big, but it was bright and quiet, and mine. I signed the lease in my own name without anyone peering over my shoulder, and the pen felt oddly heavy in my hand. When I moved in, I opened a box I hadn't touched since moving home, and found the fountain pen Marin had given me years ago. I remembered what she'd said when she handed it to me. You should own something no one else can claim. At the time it sounded poetic. Now it felt prophetic. I pinned her letter to the corkboard above my desk, the first thing I put up in the new place. Then I started drafting a new audio project, not for clients, not for income, but for myself. Something creative, something unmonitored. It was the first thing I had done in years that didn't exist to please or placate anyone. As the days passed, news trickled in. Sienna had crashed a major project at work because she was too consumed with trying to get the family to pressure me. Bryce quietly moved out of the house, unwilling to stay once the potential financial gain evaporated. My parents kept to themselves in the big Magnolia home, the rooms quieter than ever. No one mentioned Christmas again. The relatives who had once flooded my phone slowly faded. Without a reaction from me, they lost momentum. And then one night, I received another anonymous text, the same number as before. It said simply, "You weren't wrong. Some of us saw what was coming. We just couldn't stop it." I stared at the message for a long time. Not because I needed validation, but because it closed the last unanswered thread of that night. Someone in that family had seen enough to warn me. Someone who also stayed silent. Standing by the window of my new apartment, I watched the lights shimmer on the water. Seattle looked softer from here, like a new city instead of the one I'd survived. I thought about everything that led me here, the neglect, the manipulation, the night they pushed me out, and the letter that proved someone once believed I deserved more. I wasn't free of the hurt. I wasn't pretending it didn't ache. I still grieved the version of the family I had imagined, the one that never truly existed. But that grief didn't make me want to go back. It made me want to move forward. I realized then that I hadn't lost my family at all. I had lost the illusion of them. And losing an illusion isn't a tragedy. It's clarity. I didn't know what my future would look like, not exactly. But as I stood there in my own place, breathing air that didn't belong to anyone else's expectations, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: for the first time in my life, every step I took from this point on would be mine alone. When I look back on everything, every word spoken around that dinner table, every silence that cut deeper than the shouting, it becomes painfully clear that sometimes the breaking point isn't a moment of weakness. Sometimes it's the first moment of truth. For years, I tried to shrink myself to fit into a family that only saw what they wanted me to be. I tried to earn love that should have been unconditional. I tried to carry expectations that were never mine to hold, but walking away showed me something I never knew I needed to learn. You don't have to stay where you're only tolerated. You don't owe your life to people who only value you when you're useful. And sometimes the hardest thing you can do, the thing that feels like tearing a part of yourself off, is the thing that finally sets you free. I used to think that family was something fixed, something you were born into and chained to forever. But the truth is gentler and harsher at the same time. Family is simply the place where you are seen, where you're allowed to grow, where you don't have to apologize for existing. And if the people who raised you can't give you that, then you're allowed to find it somewhere else. You're allowed to build it from scratch. You're allowed to become someone you finally recognize. What happened to me wasn't just about money. It wasn't about inheritance or legal documents or who deserved what. It was about being forced to confront a reality I spent decades avoiding, that I had been living in a house full of people who didn't know me and maybe never cared to. It hurt. It still does. But pain isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's a door. And stepping through it is the beginning of becoming who you were meant to be. If there's anything I hope my story leaves you with, it's this: you don't have to justify your worth, not to family, not to anyone. Your value doesn't come from what you can give, what you can fix, or what you can sacrifice. It comes from being human, messy, growing, learning, stumbling, and deserving love that exists without conditions. And if you haven't found that kind of love yet, don't give up. Sometimes it's waiting on the other side of a door you're afraid to close. And before I end this, I want to say something to you, the person watching or listening right now. I know stories like this hit differently depending on where you are in your own life. Maybe you're dealing with a complicated family. Maybe you're carrying guilt that isn't yours. Maybe you're standing at your own threshold wondering whether you should stay or walk away. Whatever it is, I hope you know you're not alone in that feeling. I hope you know your boundaries don't make you selfish. They make you whole. And if you've made it this far with me, could you drop a listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from? It means more than you realize. Knowing someone is out there, someone who stayed to hear the ending, reminds me that connection doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from moments like this, from strangers who understand parts of your story without ever meeting you. If my story touched something in you, even a small part, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. Not for numbers, not for any kind of status, but because this space has become a place where stories like mine can finally breathe. A place where pain can turn into clarity, and where people who've been dismissed, ignored, or pushed aside can feel seen for once. I'm rebuilding my life now, one day at a time. And if you choose to stay connected, maybe you'll walk with me through the next chapters too. Because healing isn't a straight line, it's a journey. And sometimes having someone there, even from a distance, makes all the difference. Thank you for listening. Truly. And wherever you are tonight, I hope you choose yourself too.